Hello guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. So historians use the term popular culture to refer to the common ideas, customs, and behavior of a particular group or country. And this might mean the music people listen to, the films they watched, the books they read, and the important beliefs, fashions, technology, and news of the time. So what about popular culture in America during the 1930s? Well, jazz remained as popular as it had been in the 1920s, and jazz artists such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Billie Holiday continued to sell huge numbers of records. Performers such as Glenn Miller, Judy Garland, and Bing Crosby also found fame in this decade. In fact, the famous fantasy film, The Wizard of Oz, in which Judy Garland plays Dorothy Gale, a farm girl from Kansas who gets swept into a magical world, was produced in 1939. Characterized by its use of Technicolor, one of the first of its time, fantasy storytelling, musical score, and memorable characters like the Tin Man and the Lion, the film became an American pop culture icon, and it was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and won Best Original Song for Over the Rainbow. Radio also continued to be the way that most people listened to music, but gramophone sales increased in the 1930s as vinyl records became a common method of listening to recorded music. Radio also broadcast poetry, plays, news reports, live sport, and variety shows. A trip to the cinema was one of the most popular leisure activities of the 1930s. The 60 million people who went each week often wanted to escape the troubles of the Depression and be transported into another world. And the kind of glamour and excitement of cinemas did this for them. As a result, musicals such as 42nd Street, comedies starring Charlie Chaplin and Laurel and Hardy, Walt Disney cartoons, historical dramas such as Gone with the Wind, and horror films such as Frankenstein and Dracula were incredibly popular. Cartoons also became more commonplace during this time, with the arrival of Mickey Mouse and the development of Disney as a company. In the early 1930s, Walt Disney produced another series called The Silly Symphonies, which you can see behind me to my right, to go along with the Mickey series. And it featured different casts of characters in each film and enabled animators to experiment with stories that relied less on the gags and quick humor of the Mickey cartoons and more on mood, emotion, and musical themes. Eventually, the Silly Symphonies turned into the training ground for all Disney artists as they prepared for the advent of animated feature films. Flowers and Trees, a Silly Symphony, and the first full-color cartoon won the Academy Award for Best Cartoon for 1932, the first year that the Academy offered such a category. And for the rest of that decade, a Disney cartoon won the Oscar every single year. One night in 1934, Walt Disney informed his animators that they were going to make an animated featured film. And then he told them that the story of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs was going to be the main story behind it. Now, there were some skeptics in the group, but before long, everyone had caught Walt's enthusiasm and work began in earnest. And it took 3 years to make, but the landmark film debuted on December the 21st, 1937, and became a spectacular hit. Snow White soon became the highest grossing film of all time, a record it held until it was surpassed by Gone with the Wind, which I mentioned earlier, and now Walt Disney's studio had firmer footing, so the short cartoons paid the bills, but Walt knew that the future profits would actually come from feature films. And if you think about where Disney is today, then that is just a huge, dramatic, amazing, and incredible progression of this company to something that is, renowned across the globe. We also see the development of comic books that become incredibly popular in the 1930s. Comics were bright, cheap, and easy to read for the masses of young people desperate to escape the world or into a world of adventure. And the first ones began to appear really after 1933, but their popularity soared after the 1938 publication of Action Comics, including the debut of Superman. And this event could be summed up as the undies on the outside, where the two most important characters in the history of comics first appeared, that is Superman and then also Batman. At the time of their first appearances, they were both huge hits. And when Superman crossed over from comic books to comic strips, his appeal went from just children reading the books to entire families reading his adventures in the daily newspaper. And then again, once radio started featuring Superman's adventures, the pop culture explosion began. The Great Depression also inspired authors such as Erskine Caldwell, John Steinbeck, and James T. Farrell to write about the poverty, racism, and social problems they had witnessed. Farrell's Studs Lonergan trilogy, for example, if you can see on the far right to me, for example, tells the story of an average Irish American who slowly deteriorates in the 1930s from a tough but kind-hearted teenage boy to an angry, physically exhausted alcoholic. And some of the most famous pieces of American literature were produced during the 1930s. Again, The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck in 1939, tells the story of a poor farming family from Oklahoma who traveled to California during the Great Depression in search of a new life. He also wrote Of Mice and Men, both of which can be seen to symbolize the American spirit at the time, linked with themes of economic powerlessness, which kind of came about because of the Great Depression. In particular, The Grapes of Wrath evokes the harshness of the Depression and arouses sympathy for the struggles of migrant farm workers. And Steinbeck actually based his novel on his real visits to the migrant camps and tent cities of the workers, seeing firsthand the horrible living conditions of migrant families. Now, his novel, with its easily accessible style, was widely welcomed and hailed by working class readers, though it was actually just as widely panned by business and government officials who took offense at its socialist overtones and denounced it as communist propaganda. Remember, we're at the time now, we've had the first Red Scare, where people are terrified of this communist ideologies trickling over from Russia that's just gone through its revolution. And some local areas, including Kern County, California, where some of the characters in the book actually settle, actually branded the book as slanderous and even burned copies of it and banned it from libraries and schools. So taking a very extreme reaction to the book because of this fear of socialist undertones. Nonetheless, though, it was the top-selling novel of 1939, and it won a Pulitzer Prize in 1940, one of the most acclaimed prizes for literature. And the year of the acclaimed, in 1940 was also the year of the acclaimed film adaptation of the book as well. And Steinbeck plainly stated his purpose in writing the novel, which was, "I want to put a tag of shame on the greedy who are responsible for this, the depression and the plight of the worker." Okay. Moving on to the arts then, another key aspect of popular culture. Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt was keen for artists, musicians, writers, and actors to continue their work during the Great Depression. And he set up something called the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which provided work for unemployed artists of all kinds. And actors were hired to put on free shows, artists to, paint pictures for displays in schools, libraries and parks, and writers were, funded to produce guidebooks on every state in America. Much of this artistic output produced by the WPA still actually exists to this day, and it made many Americans more aware of their own traditions, history, and culture than they had ever been before. However, there were some people who criticized the WPA for wasting taxpayers' money. But when asked to answer these criticisms, the head of the WPA, Harry Hopkins, actually replied, "Hell, they've just got to eat like the rest of us." So we have two kind of arguments there, don't we, about the WPA. On the one hand, it's allowing Americans to have a stronger link to their kind of culture and traditions, and on the other hand, potentially wasting taxpayers' money in a time of economic crisis. So to give a kind of summary and overview then, by going through a timeline of developments in popular culture in America during the 1930s. Well, in 1931, the world's tallest building for the next 35 years is constructed, and that is the Empire State Building in New York City. Then in 1932, we have the first Mickey Mouse color cartoon. In 1933, prohibition ends and people take to the bars and the cafes and the nightclubs again. In 1934, we have the first Masters golf tournament held at Augusta National Golf Club in Georgia. In 1935, the rumba becomes the latest dance craze, and also the Monopoly board game goes on sale. In 1936, the bass guitar is invented by a man named Paul Tutmark of Seattle in Washington. In 1937, Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is released. And in 1939, we have crazes including knock-knock jokes, roller skating, and the board game Chinese checkers.